Everyone knows the story of the discovery of penicillin. It was a matter of sloppy practice in Sir Alexander Fleming's laboratory in London in 1928. And a Petri dish was contaminated by mold, and Fleming discovered that the mold killed the bacteria in the Petri dish. Everyone also knows what happened after that, because the answer is nothing. That was in 1928, and for 10 years after the discovery of what would prove to be one of the most important products and innovations of the 20th century, a discovery that would in the end save millions of lives and make millions of pounds and dollars in profit for pharmaceutical companies. It was simply neglected. It sat in an academic journal. The reason was that there was simply no scientifically oriented pharmaceutical industry at the time. There were sort of the beginnings of that. The German company Bayer had produced aspirin in the late 19th century and had discovered in the 1930s that there was some antibacterial action from some of its dyestuff products. But there was nothing like the industry that we recognize today. Two things happened 10 years later that changed it. One was that the Rockefeller Foundation funded some research at Oxford universities, which led to the synthesis of penicillin, to method of producing this mold artificially. And the second was the outbreak of the Second World War. And the outbreak of the Second World War led some American companies, particularly Merck, after Pearl Harbor, to look at what they could contribute to the ongoing war effort. And one of their ideas was to pick up the production of penicillin, the synthesis of penicillin, which they were then able to do on a large scale. And that turned Merck into a research-oriented pharmaceutical business. And it discovered another powerful antibiotic, streptomycin, marketed that. It actually licensed that freely to various companies, and it saved more and more lives. In Britain, ICI, Britain's leading chemical company, the board of ICI realized, somewhat presciently, that the future of chemistry in business was in pharmaceuticals. They actually set up a pharmaceutical division in the late 40s, which lost money for them for 20 years. In the US, Merck and Pfizer pioneered the development of commercial pharmaceuticals, with statements that are now revered in terms of business ethics. George Merck famously said to an audience at a medical school, "We never forget that medicine is for the people, not for the profits." And he went on, and the better we have remembered it, the more profitable we have actually been. And Johnson & Johnson wrote a rather wordy credo, which essentially incorporates the same sentiments at rather greater length. As things developed, ICI, Johnson & Johnson, Merck, to develop products that both saved millions of lives and made very large amounts of money for their shareholders. They epitomized what was best in business in terms of both profits and products. And both companies illustrated and developed what are now classic business school cases. In Johnson & Johnson's case, there was Tylenol, which was their analgesic, where someone, we still don't know who it was, though investigative journalists have suspicions, spiked some Johnson & Johnson products with cyanide. And the remarkable thing about that was that following the credo, managers across Johnson & Johnson went round pulling that product from the shelves of pharmacies, confident, correctly, that senior management would back them up in that decision. Some Merck scientists realized or thought that a veterinary product, which the company had, would help cure or deal with the parasitic-driven river blindness, which was a curse of West Africa. And they experimented, and they discovered it really did. The trouble was there wasn't really a profitable market for that. The people who needed the drug had no money, the governments of these countries were weak, and in the end, after looking for charitable funding, Merck decided that the only course of action open to them was to distribute the product for free, which, as a matter of fact, they still do. These are classic cases of profitable business and business ethics. And then in the 1990s, it all changed. It all went wrong. There are several parts to that, several exemplars of that. Merck, from the mid-80s to the mid-90s, annually topped Fortune's survey of America's most admired companies. But under pressure from Wall Street to match the earnings growth of its rival Pfizer, Merck adopted a growth strategy. The centerpiece of that growth strategy was a drug called Vioxx. What happened was that there are the analgesics, the things we all have for curing headaches. And the trouble is that there are certain people who don't tolerate analgesics very well. And Vioxx was suitable for these kinds of people. The problem was that the money to be made in selling this drug was not selling it to the minority of people who derived a particular benefit from it. It was from selling it to the millions of people whose headaches would equally well be treated by an aspirin. But an aspirin cost 1 cent and a Vioxx cost $1. It's clear what was more attractive for the industry. But then it was discovered that in a minority of people, Vioxx aggravated heart problems. The result was the usual flurry of US litigation. The result was ultimately that Vioxx was pulled from sale, and the reputation of Merck never quite recovered from that particular story. In Britain, ICI, which had become dominated by its pharmaceutical business, which was then the profit driver of the company, came under attack from Hanson Trust. It decided to change its mission statement, which historically had been the responsible application of chemistry and related sciences to business, to a new mission statement, which was roughly to maximize shareholder value. As a result, it divested the pharmaceutical business into Zeneca. It took over a variety of seemingly exciting new businesses, which would maximize shareholder value. And finally, in 2007, ICI disappeared as a result of the burden of debt which this transformation had imposed on it. I remember back in 2006 telling parts of the story to an audience like this one. And the following day, I got a pained letter from ICI's Vice President for Corporate Social Responsibility. What the letter said, roughly speaking, was we might have screwed up the business, but we did a great job on corporate social responsibility. I thought we really have people who do not understand what corporate social responsibility means. In the pharmaceutical industry, it got worse. There was a US pharmaceutical firm called Valeant. It was taken over by a new management team who decided that you could cut research and development, focus on marketing, raise the price of your existing products, and make a great deal more money, at least for the time being. And there were a whole series of these. The worst was another company called Turing Pharmaceuticals. But the worst of all was, of course, the promotion of the sale of opioids, particularly by the Sackler Purdue Pharmaceutical Company, but also even by once more respected firms such as Johnson & Johnson. That takes us on to 2019, 2020. It takes us to COVID-19. It takes us to the world in which vaccines were produced at great speed by the pharmaceutical industry, which made a great deal of difference in controlling that epidemic. This industry illustrates so often and so frequently business at its best and at its worst. But the events I've described have eroded trust in the pharmaceutical industry to quite dramatic degrees. In 2019, Gallup took a poll in which they asked people, do you view these activities favorably and unfavorably? And the worst favorability ratio was obtained for pharmacology. The only things that were nearly as bad as pharmacology were healthcare, other forms of healthcare, public relations, and the federal government. There are lessons there, I think, for us all. That mistrust meant not just that the vaccines are celebrated in the outer fringes of conspiracy theories, but that quite reasonable people are concerned, not without justification, that people are not honest about identifying and dealing with the side effects of drugs like that. So what do we learn from the story I've been telling? Well, I've probably talked about pharmacology in more detail than anyone in this room feels they need to know. But I've done that because I think it's really important, if we talk about business ethics, that we get into the detail of what it is that business do and not just be content to throw our hands in the air and talk about ESG, corporate social responsibility, and the like. The pharmaceutical industry today, as you will know, as the US government tries to control the prices of pharmaceuticals, poses quite large issues about the relationship between business and government, about the funding of the activity, the research and development activities of the pharmaceutical industry. And we need all to be willing to engage with these issues and to address them. We also need to recognize that what went so wrong in the pharmaceutical industry was that these firms were under more and more pressure essentially from Wall Street and some asset managers to demonstrate a pattern of steadily increasing earnings growth. And as Valiant illustrated, it's always possible to do that in pharmacology by cutting back on R&D and spending a bit more in the short term on marketing. I want to argue that ethics depends on the details of business practice. All the companies I've described had statements of business purpose. But in most cases, these statements of business purpose bore very little relation to what the company actually did. The impact of the Johnson & Johnson credo and Merck's assertion that medicine is for the people is that these were actually reflections of the business itself, not something that the chief executive said about the business because he thought people would like to hear. Going back to that, in the mid-20th century, there was a serious case for saying that management had become a professional activity of the kind the military, the priesthood, law and accountancy, and so on, had at any rate once been. That someone who was a manager of a large corporation took on a social role as well as a role as an employee of an organization. That culture eroded. And I'll end with two illustrations of how it eroded. One is to pick up a quote from Harper Lee in To Kill a Mockingbird, when Atticus Finch says, I can't be one person at home and another person in the town. And I wonder what it is that people who promoted the sale of opioids to people in small towns in Appalachia, what did they tell their children when they went home? You can't be one person in the town and you can't a different person at home. And if we take that motto on board, we have a very clear view of what ethical business actually means. But finally, I want to recall an occasion on which I asked a retired chief executive of a very large British company to come and talk to my class at London Business School. And at the end of it, he turned to me and he said, you know, these kids regard being CEO of a large company as a prize, not a responsibility. If we're to be serious about business ethics, that's a prevalent view which we need to address and reverse. Thank you very much.